Have you ever wondered what happened to the great empires of history? The Romans, the Mayans, the Ottomans. Why did they eventually just disappear? Why do even the most powerful civilizations collapse? Well, in this analysis, we're going to dig into the historical patterns behind societal collapse. This powerful idea is really at the heart of our question. It tells us that every society, no matter how advanced it seems, has a lifespan. They rise, they have their moment in the sun, and then eventually they fall. So, is it a sudden, dramatic event, or is it more like a slow, creeping decay, or something else entirely? Come on, let's dive in and really examine the mechanics of collapse by looking at the patterns that history has shown us time and time again. Okay, first things first, let's get our terms straight. When we say collapse, what immediately comes to mind are ruined cities, right? But the reality is usually a lot more complex. We need to look past that dramatic image to get a clearer picture of what the process actually means. So collapse isn't necessarily an apocalypse. It's really about a rapid loss of complexity. Think about the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It didn't just vanish overnight, but over the course of a few decades, its incredibly intricate systems of government and trade just crumbled, and the empire broke apart into smaller, more localized communities. When you start looking at history, you begin to see the same kinds of triggers popping up again and again right before a society unravels. We can actually group these pressures into four main categories. You can think of them as the Four Horsemen of Collapse. The first horseman represents the raw power of nature, a sudden, severe environmental shift, like a drought, a flood, or a major climate change, can pull the rug right out from under a society, especially one that depends heavily on agriculture. And this is a global phenomenon. The sophisticated Indus Valley civilization was weakened after a severe, prolonged drought. Centuries later, the Little Ice Age brought famine and crop failure to Europe, and in North America, the ancestral Puebloans abandoned their established homes because of something called the Great Drought. Our second horseman is disease. Pandemics have profoundly shaped societies by wiping out huge chunks of the population, shattering economies, and destabilizing governments. They are powerful, invisible agents of collapse. And this is not just a modern problem. The Antonine Plague weakens the Roman Empire back in the 2nd century. 400 years later, the plague of Justinian hit Byzantium, maybe even sealing the fate of the old empire. And of course, there's the Black Death, which killed up to 200 million people and fundamentally changed the course of Eurasian history. The third horseman comes from the outside. This could be a direct invasion, sure, but it could also be the disruption of vital trade routes or a migration of desperate people. For a society that's already weakened, a shock from the outside can be the final blow. The Late Bronze Age collapse in the Mediterranean was triggered by mysterious invaders known only as the Sea Peoples. In Mesopotamia, the Mongol invasions didn't just conquer cities, they destroyed the ancient irrigation systems, turning farmland into wasteland. And the Aztec Empire fell to a devastating 1-2 punch of Spanish military might and Old World diseases. Our final horseman is maybe the most insidious, because it comes from within. This is the slow rot of a society through things like economic mismanagement, soaring inequality, corruption, and a loss of social trust and unity. Rome is a classic example. Its reliance on slave labor, its debasement of the currency to pay its debts, and the enormous gap between the rich and the poor all eroded the empire's foundation. More broadly, historians like Peter Turchin have identified repeating cycles where rising inequality consistently leads to political instability and eventually collapse. So we've seen the causes, but what does the process of collapse actually feel like for the people living through it? Drawing from the collapse of the Soviet Union, the author and engineer Dmitri Orlov developed a chilling 5-stage model that shows how the failure of one system triggers a domino effect. This model moves from the abstract to the deeply personal. It starts with money and markets, then moves to government, then to community, and finally to our faith in each other. Each stage makes the next one more likely. It all starts when faith in the financial system evaporates. Savings disappear, money becomes worthless. This quickly leads to commercial collapse. Global supply chains snap, imports stop, and store shelves go empty. The abstract crisis becomes a very real, tangible problem fast. Next up is political collapse. The now bankrupt government can no longer provide basic services like policing, infrastructure, or a social safety net. As the official structures crumble, People turn to local groups, charities, community leaders, anyone who can help. But soon, those groups run out of resources too, leading to social collapse. And that brings us to stage 5, cultural collapse. Faith in the goodness of humanity is lost. Kindness and compassion disappear. The family unit breaks down. It becomes a brutal dog-eat-dog struggle for survival, summed up by this terrifying quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn: "You die today so that I can die tomorrow." Now that we've seen the how, let's take a step back and look at the deeper why. A couple of big theories help us understand the fundamental forces that drive these cycles of rise and fall, taking us beyond specific triggers to the very structure of civilizations themselves. Let's look at 2 major ideas. First, Joseph Tainter argues that societies are problem-solving organizations. They constantly add complexity, bureaucracy, technology to deal with new challenges. But eventually, they hit a point of diminishing returns, where the cost of adding more complexity outweighs the benefits. At that point, collapse is just a radical, necessary simplification. The historian Arnold Toynbee saw it differently. For him, it was a failure of leadership. Civilizations thrive when a creative elite comes up with new solutions. But when that elite becomes rigid and just forces the majority to obey, it loses its ability to adapt, and society rots from the top down. So, what does all this mean for us right now? What can these patterns from the Bronze Age, from ancient Rome, and from pre-modern Europe teach us about navigating our own incredibly complex world? Well, when you boil it all down, the same warning signs appear over and over again. A widening gap between the haves and the have-nots, depleting the natural resources you depend on, political polarization and the loss of a shared identity, and institutions that become too rigid to solve new problems. These are history's red flags. And that brings us to the most critical point. Studying collapse isn't about predicting doom. It's about understanding the consequences of our actions. History shows us what happens when societies ignore these warning signs. The past offers a roadmap of what not to do. So the real question isn't whether we're doomed to repeat history, but whether we will choose to learn from it.